Hello guys, welcome back again to this tutorial. So in this section we'll be talking about CSS transition, an important aspect of CSS. So before we proceed, someone may ask what is even the benefits of using CSS transition in our web page? What why do we need CSS transition in building websites? So but then the trick there is that CSS transition is one of the simplest way to create a smooth interactive effect on a web page. That is a smooth and interactive effect on a web page. So what is CSS transition? CSS transition allows HTML elements to smoothly change from one style to another when an event happens. So event like on hover, click, and so on. In a layman understanding, or you can just see it as telling the browser whenever this property changes its value, do not update the value instantly. Just move slowly from the former or the previous state to the new value. So that's how it works. So before we proceed, let's first note down the properties that are associated with what CSS transition. The first is what we know as the transition property. So the transition property specify on the particular CSS property you want to transit. That's that special or that particular CSS property you want to transit, such as or it might be width, it might be height, it might be background color, it might be opacity, and so on. So the next property is what we know as the transition duration. So the transition duration talk about the length of time for the property to transit. That is how long you want the property to transit. Is it like 2 seconds or 5 minutes or 300 or 1000 milliseconds? The next property is the transition timing function. So the transition timing function just depends on how far you want the transition to happen. So we have something like the easy, the linear, the easy in, the easy out, and the easy in out. So the next property is the transition delay. Transition delay is just talking about when you want the transition to start, just like how you want the property to stay before it starts transiting. So let's quickly have a small demo project to demonstrate what we are saying. For example, I have my button that says click me. So over here my styling, I'm making use of internal styling. So I can have my button here. Good. So I can proceed. Let's say background color should be blue, color should be white. So next one, we'll give it padding. Padding, let's say 10 pesos and 15 pesos. So next one, we can give it, let's say border none. So over there in our browser, we have something like this, right? So let's move back and continue. So the next thing you're going to have, in order to shift it, to move it from the edge to like where we're going to see it. So either we make use of margin left. Okay, let's make use of margin left of 20 pesos, and then margin top of, let's say, the same 20 pesos. So over there in our browser, see it. So we can decide to increase the margin left, let's say half 100 pesos. So okay, so we can see it, right? So okay, so we proceed with border radius to give it just a smooth edge curve. So we have something like this. Good. So what we are going to do next is we are going to add our what, a transition property, because this transition property is what is going to enable us to give that effect to this element. So we have transition property. So you see what is required now is what is the transition property that is requesting. So after this property, you see, is demanding some values. So the first thing we are going to add, because we want to transit, let's say want to, whenever we hover on this button, let the width expand. So what we're going to do now, under this transition, we add our width. So here now, this is the transition property. So we can decide to add the transition duration, that is the time. So I can decide to say, let's say 1.2 seconds, right? Good. So I can decide to add my transition timing function, let's say easy, something like this. So now down here is where I'm going to add my effects. So I can do something like this: button on hover. So now here, remember my transition property here is width. So that's what I'm going to put here. So now when I'm going to add my width here. So which effect do I want it to happen on the width when the button is hovered? So I want it to increase by what? 100 pixels, right? So over there in my browser, if I hover on this, you see the width increases, right, to 100 pixels. So I can decide to do, okay, let's increase it to 150, and possibly add, let's say, kuzo pointer. So over there, so you can see it increases, right? So I can decide to add some other property. So I can say some other transition property. So let's say, okay, here I will separate this with a comma, and then to enable me to add other properties. So I can decide to use transform. So what is the time duration? The transition duration. So I can say, okay, let the transition duration be 0.2 still seconds, right? And then the transition timing function should be what? Easy. So here in this section, so what I'm going to do here now, I'm going to add my transform property. So I want to have my scale. So this scale is of many ways. I can decide to scale on X axis, that is something like this, or I can decide to scale on what? Y axis. So, but this I want to scale on both axes, so I will use the shorthand property like this, scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my 1.1. So this means scale on X axis 1 and scale on Y axis 1. So over there in my browser, I have something like this. So if I try to hover on this, you see, the button is scaling. So I can decide to say, okay, let me reduce this so that we can see the effect of this transform. So if I hover on it, you see, it's scaling, right? It's scaling. Good. So let's do another thing. Let's do another thing. So here we just implement this with buttons. So let's try to implement this with an image. So let's say here I have a div. I have a div. So and I have an image. I have an image inside the div. So let me just add my image. So over there in my browser, I have something like this, right? So good. So I'm going to come here to style it. I will now say my div image. So I want you to have width of what? 200 pesos. I want you to have height of what? Auto. Good. I want you to have border, or I can decide to add it border. 1 peso solid. Let's say red. Cool. So I can decide to add my transition property. So it will enable me to add effects that I want it to transit. So I have my transition property. So first and foremost, I want it to transform. So I'm just adding only transform because that's what I want to achieve. So it can scale whenever I hover on the image. So I want the image to scale whenever I hover on it. So I'll make use of transition transform property only. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm not going to add my what? Transition duration, let's say 0.3 seconds. Then my transition timing function, let's say the same easy. Okay. So I have something like this. So I can decide to add other property, or okay, let me just leave it like this. So now over there in my browser, I still have something like this. So you can see here's what I just did. So no effect yet. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to come down here and write my div image. So whenever I hover on you, that is the image inside the div. Whenever I hover on you, I want you to transform. So what am I transforming? Scale still 1.1, and then I want to add other functionality. Okay, so over here in my browser, you see, if I hover on it, okay, sorry, I haven't added my hover pseudo class. So here now I've added my pseudo class. So over here, if I hover on it, you see how it works. See how it works. Good, cool. So I can decide to add some other transition property. Let's say opacity. So some transition property, let's say opacity opacity, right? Good. So I can try to add my timing function. So, and then this, good. So over here, I'll now add this my opacity. So I want opacity to be, let's say, 0.9, or let me make it 0.3. So over there in my browser, if I hover on it, you see it? Cool. So, and so on and so forth. So that's how you can do as many as some interactive functionality on your web page. So I hope you find this video helpful. And with this, we have come to the end of this video.